The morning of October 25th, 1944, 60 miles east of the Philippine island of Samar, Ensign William Brooks, flying a Grumman Avenger from the escort carrier St. Lo, banked his aircraft through broken clouds on routine anti-submarine patrol. At 6:37, he spotted ships on the horizon, large ships. He keyed his radio, reporting what he assumed were American vessels from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. Then he flew closer. The silhouettes were wrong. The superstructures rose in distinctive pagoda shapes. Massive gun turrets tracked his approach. Brooks's voice crackled over the radio again, this time with unmistakable urgency. "I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Task Unit 77.4.3 callsign Taffy 3, was incredulous. He demanded positive identification. Brooks, now close enough to count gun barrels, confirmed what seemed impossible. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers were steaming directly toward his position. The massive warship at the center of the formation was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons. Yamato alone outweighed all 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 combined. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Sprague understood immediately that his force was facing annihilation. His 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkoon Bay, and Gambier Bay, were slow, lightly armed vessels designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support. They could make 18 knots at best. The Japanese battleships and cruisers could manage 30. His carriers mounted single 5-inch guns, effective against aircraft but useless against armored warships. The approaching Japanese force carried guns ranging from 8 inches to the Yamato's monstrous 18.1-inch main battery. His screening destroyers Johnston, Hole, and Heermann were Fletcher-class vessels displacing 2,500 tons, nicknamed tin cans for their lack of armor. Each carried 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes, capable ships in their designed role, but hopelessly outmatched against battleships. His 4 destroyer escorts Dennis, John C., Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts were even smaller, 1,700-ton vessels armed with just 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes each. They were built to hunt submarines, not engage capital ships. The strategic situation was catastrophic. Admiral William Halsey had taken the powerful Third Fleet, including all the fast battleships and fleet carriers, north to pursue a Japanese carrier force. The 7th Fleet's old battleships were engaged to the south, finishing off a separate Japanese force in Surigao Strait. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, with 130,000 American soldiers recently landed and still dependent on seaborne supply, lay completely vulnerable just beyond the horizon. Only Taffy 3 stood between Vice Admiral Kurita's center force and potential disaster. What neither Sprague nor any American commander knew was that Japanese naval doctrine had spent the previous decade preparing for precisely this kind of encounter, and their assessment of American destroyers was one of contempt barely concealed behind professional courtesy. The story of how destroyers derided as thin-skinned and inadequate came to fight one of history's most legendary last stands began not in the waters off Samar, but in the planning rooms and fleet exercises where Japanese and American naval philosophies diverged fundamentally. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its destroyer force around the concept of decisive battle. In this doctrine, Destroyers served as offensive weapons designed to launch devastating torpedo attacks against enemy battle lines. Japanese destroyers mounted the Type 93 torpedo, called Long Lance by the Allies. These 24-inch oxygen-fueled torpedoes were the most advanced in the world, with ranges exceeding 20 miles and warheads carrying over 1,000 pounds of explosive. A single hit could cripple a cruiser. Multiple hits could sink a battleship. Japanese destroyer tactics emphasized night combat, where their superior optical equipment and intensive training gave them advantage. They practiced coordinated attacks where multiple destroyers would approach under cover of darkness, launch full spreads of torpedoes from different angles, then withdraw before enemy guns could respond effectively. In early war actions, like the battles of Savo Island and Tassafaronga, these tactics had proven devastatingly effective, sinking multiple American cruisers and destroyers while suffering minimal losses. Japanese naval officers, studying reports of American destroyer construction throughout the 1930s, noted what they considered fundamental weaknesses in American design philosophy. American destroyers emphasized balanced capabilities, anti-aircraft defense, anti-submarine warfare, and surface action, rather than specializing in offensive torpedo attacks. This meant American destroyers carried fewer torpedoes, mounted lighter torpedo armament, and devoted significant weight and space to dual-purpose guns, effective against aircraft but less powerful in surface engagements. More critically, from the Japanese perspective, American destroyers lacked adequate armor protection. Fletcher-class destroyers had hull plating measuring fractions of an inch thick. Their gun shields protected crews from shrapnel but offered no defense against shells from cruisers or battleships. Japanese heavy cruisers mounted 8-inch guns firing 250-pound armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate battleship armor at combat ranges. Against unarmored destroyers, these shells would punch through hull plating like paper. The assessment, discussed in pre-war Japanese naval circles and reflected in tactical planning, was that American destroyers were fragile vessels optimized for defensive screening rather than offensive action. They would be effective at protecting carriers from air attack and hunting submarines, but in surface action against heavy units, they would be outgunned, outranged, and unable to withstand return fire. The term used in some Japanese tactical assessments translated roughly as thin-skinned vessels that could deal damage but could not absorb it. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong. American destroyer doctrine did emphasize defensive roles. The vast distances of Pacific operations required destroyers with extended range, which meant larger fuel capacity and less weight available for armor. American naval doctrine expected destroyers to screen capital ships, shoot down attacking aircraft, and hunt submarines. Surface torpedo attacks against enemy battle lines were considered secondary missions. The Americans had learned painful lessons about offensive torpedo tactics in the early months of the war. At battles like the Java Sea and in the waters around Guadalcanal, American destroyers had suffered heavily when attempting to close range against Japanese forces for torpedo attacks. The decision had been made to emphasize dual-purpose gun armament over torpedo capability in later destroyer classes. By 1944, American destroyer tactics relied heavily on radar-directed gunfire and coordinated actions rather than aggressive close-range torpedo attacks. But doctrine was one thing, desperate circumstances were another, and the commanders of Taffy 3's destroyers and destroyer escorts were about to demonstrate that American vessels built for defense could attack with suicidal aggression when necessity demanded. At 6:58, Yamato's main guns opened fire on a surface target for the first time in the battleship's career. Massive 18-inch shells weighing over 3,000 pounds each screamed toward the escort carriers. The shells contained dye markers Yamatos were red, so Japanese spotters could distinguish which battleship's salvos were landing where. When the first salvo exploded in towering columns of seawater near White Plains, the spray washed across the carrier's deck tinted crimson. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn east, making their best speed and generating smoke. The wind came from the east, pushing the smoke screen back toward the pursuing Japanese, but smoke alone wouldn't save them. The Japanese force was gaining rapidly. At 7:01, Sprague issued a desperate call for help in the clear, abandoning radio procedure in the faint hope that someone, somewhere, might respond in time. Then he ordered his aircraft into the air armed with whatever ordnance they carried, bombs meant for supporting troops ashore, depth charges designed for submarines, anything that might buy minutes. His destroyers and destroyer escorts he held back momentarily, positioning them between the carriers and the oncoming Japanese fleet. Every commander understood the mathematics. Their 5-inch guns had a maximum range of 10 miles, but couldn't penetrate heavy cruiser armor even at point-blank range. Their torpedoes, effective to perhaps 5 miles, required them to close to suicidal range against battleships and cruisers that outgunned them 20-1. The only advantage they possessed was Mark 37 fire control radar, which allowed accurate fire in smoke and rain squalls. That, and the willingness to die buying time for the carriers to escape, Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer Johnston, didn't wait for orders. Evans, a Cherokee and Creek Native American from Oklahoma, had told his crew at Johnston's commissioning 1 year earlier, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." He had meant every word. At 7:05, without waiting for Sprague's attack order, Evans turned Johnston directly toward the Japanese fleet and rang up flank speed. His crew watched in disbelief as their captain steered toward 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. For the first 20 minutes, Johnston was helpless. The Japanese cruisers and battleships had her in range, but Johnston's 5-inch guns couldn't reach them. Japanese shells began landing close, walking toward the charging destroyer. 8-inch shells painted the sea with colored dye, yellow, green, red, as different Japanese ships found the range. Evans charged onward. First he passed a line of 7 Japanese destroyers, then 1 light and 3 heavy cruisers. Finally, the 4 battleships came into view. Johnston's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagan, watched an 8-inch shell explode just off the bow, its red dye splashing across his face. He wiped his eyes and remarked calmly, "Looks like somebody's mad at us." As soon as range closed enough, Johnston opened fire with all 5 5-inch guns. In 5 furious minutes, she pumped 200 rounds into the nearest heavy cruiser, the Kumano, scoring damaging hits. The Japanese shells that had been missing began to connect, but Evans pressed forward, zigzagging wildly, laying smoke, firing continuously. At 7,500 yards, less than 4 miles, he ordered, "Fire torpedoes." Johnston's torpedo director trained all 10 tubes on Kumano and launched a full spread. Then Evans whipped the destroyer around, retreating behind a heavy smoke screen. The torpedoes ran hot and straight. One blasted Kumano's bow clean off, taking the cruiser completely out of the fight. Johnston had drawn first blood, but the Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck Johnston in rapid succession, followed by 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser. The destroyer shuddered under the impacts. It was like a puppy being smacked by a truck, one survivor later recalled. Johnston lost all power to her steering engine, all power to the 3 5-inch guns in the after part of the ship, and her gyro compass. Through what Evans called sheer providence, a rainstorm materialized and Johnston ducked into it for desperate damage control. At 7:50, Sprague officially ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to make torpedo attacks. Johnston had already expended her torpedoes, and with only one engine functioning, she couldn't keep up with the other destroyers. But that wasn't Commander Evans's way of fighting, a crew member remembered. "We'll go in with the destroyers and provide fire support," Evans announced. Howell and Heermann charged forward with Johnston in trail, all 3 destroyers weaving through Japanese shell splashes, returning fire. Howell fired at the battleship Congo at maximum range, torpedoes missing but forcing the Japanese ship to maneuver violently. Japanese battleships and cruisers surrounded Howell, pummeling her with shells. Howell's captain, Commander Leon Kintberger, took her in for a second torpedo attack despite flooding and damaged engines, firing her remaining torpedoes before Japanese shells finally reduced her to a sinking wreck. Heermann nearly collided with Yamato during the chaos of smoke and rain, forcing the massive battleship to turn away to avoid ramming the American destroyer. Heermann's captain, Commander Amos Hathaway, took advantage of the moment to launch torpedoes at the battleship Haruna and the heavy cruiser Haguro. The torpedoes forced both Japanese ships into evasive maneuvers, disrupting their pursuit of the carriers. But it was the destroyer escorts that shocked the Japanese most. These vessels, smaller and lighter than the destroyers, had no business attacking battleships. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, commanding the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, watched the 3 destroyers charge. Sprague had given no orders for the destroyer escorts to attack. They were supposed to stay with the carriers, providing anti-aircraft defense and anti-submarine screening. Copeland made his decision. He keyed the ship's public address system and spoke to his crew of 224 men. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Samuel B. Roberts turned toward the Japanese fleet. With only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes, she was the most lightly armed vessel on the American side. Copeland ordered the crew to remain silent as they approached, guns trained but not firing, to avoid attracting attention. A Japanese shell struck their mast anyway, but Roberts pressed forward through smoke and rain. At 4,500 yards, about 2.5 miles, Roberts closed on the heavy cruiser Chokai. This was danger close range. Chokai's 8-inch guns couldn't depress low enough to hit the destroyer escort tucked in close to her hull. Roberts launched all 3 torpedoes. They missed, but the 5-inch guns opened fire at point-blank range. One shell struck Chokai's torpedo battery. The secondary explosion disabled the cruiser's propulsion and steering, taking her out of the battle as effectively as a torpedo hit would have. Chokai returned fire, scoring hits on Roberts, but the destroyer escort had accomplished her mission. One Japanese heavy cruiser was dead in the water. Roberts then turned her attention to the heavy cruiser Chikuma, engaging in a furious gun duel. Roberts's crew loaded and fired their 5-inch guns as rapidly as human hands could work, raining shells on Chikuma's superstructure. They were using armor-piercing shells designed for surface targets, not the high-explosive rounds typically loaded for anti-aircraft work. Against thin superstructure armor, the AP shells punched through and detonated inside, causing devastating damage. For over an hour, Roberts fought Chikuma, her 2 guns against the cruiser's 8 8-inch and 4 5-inch guns. Gunner's mate Paul Carr, commanding Roberts's aftergun turret, kept firing even after Japanese shells knocked out electrical power and communications. When a Japanese shell finally penetrated the turret, the explosion killed most of the crew and ignited powder charges. Carr, mortally wounded, tried to load one final shell before collapsing. At 9:35, after expending all 630 rounds of 5-inch ammunition aboard, with her engines destroyed and fires raging, Roberts lost power completely. Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. At 10:05, Samuel B. Roberts rolled over and sank, taking 89 men with her, including Paul Carr, dragged from his turret but dying from his wounds moments later. The destroyer Johnston continued fighting. With her bridge destroyed, Commander Evans shifted command to the fantail, shouting steering orders through an open hatch to men turning the rudder by hand. Johnston engaged Japanese cruisers and destroyers for over 3 hours, zigzagging through rain squalls, firing her remaining forward guns, making simulated torpedo runs to distract Japanese ships from the carriers. Japanese destroyers finally surrounded Johnston. In short order, they knocked out her last engine, her last gun, and set most of the ship ablaze. At 9:45, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. At 10:10, Johnston rolled over and began to sink. At 10:10, Johnston rolled over and began to sink. As she went down, the crew of the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze sailed past the sinking American warship. In a moment that would become legend, the Japanese captain ordered his crew to attention. They lined the rails and rendered a formal salute to Johnston and her crew, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. Of Johnston's complement of 327 men, only 141 survived. Commander Ernest Evans was observed in a life raft but was never seen again, presumed dead among the 92 men who vanished into the ocean after the ship sank. Hoyle had already gone down, taking 253 men with her. Samuel B. Roberts had taken 89 to the bottom. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, pounded by Japanese cruiser fire, capsized and sank. Over 1,500 American sailors were dead, dying, or struggling in the water. The Japanese had lost 3 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, to the combined efforts of the destroyers, destroyer escorts, and aircraft from the carriers. And then, inexplicably, the Japanese withdrew. At 9:25, Vice Admiral Kurita, aboard Yamato, ordered his force to break off the attack and retire. His reasons remain debated by historians. His communications with his scattered fleet were poor. His force had been under continuous air attack from Taffy 3's aircraft and from other American carriers to the south. The ferocious destroyer attacks had sunk or crippled 3 of his heavy cruisers. Yamato had been forced to turn away from torpedoes, taking her out of the action for critical minutes. Most significantly, Kurita believed he was facing fleet carriers and heavy cruisers from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, not the light escort carriers and destroyers he actually engaged. The smoke, rain squalls, and aggressive American tactics had created confusion. Japanese lookouts reported American cruisers where only destroyers fought. The volume of accurate 5-inch fire from American ships suggested larger vessels with heavier armament than the Japanese expected from mere destroyers. The fact that American destroyers and destroyer escorts had charged his battleships at all defied Japanese tactical expectations. Doctrine dictated that light forces should withdraw behind smoke when faced with overwhelming superiority. Instead, these thin-skinned American vessels had attacked with what Japanese officers later described as reckless abandon and suicidal courage. This was not how screening destroyers were supposed to behave. It suggested these might be vanguard units of a much larger force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Kurita's decision to withdraw saved the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf from potential catastrophe. It also saved what remained of Taffy 3, but the withdrawal didn't represent Japanese failure to understand surface combat. Their tactics had been sound, their gunnery excellent, their force overwhelming. What they had failed to anticipate was that American destroyer crews, when defending carriers and an invasion force they knew lay helpless beyond the horizon, would fight with intensity that transcended tactical doctrine. The battle's aftermath revealed the true cost of the engagement. Over 1,500 Americans had died, 4 ships had been sunk, but they had turned back a force that included the most powerful battleship ever built, supported by 3 additional battleships and multiple heavy cruisers. They had accomplished this with vessels Japanese planners had considered inadequate for surface action against capital ships. Japanese post-battle assessments struggled to reconcile what had happened with pre-war doctrine. The after-action reports from Kurita's commanders described American destroyers fighting like cornered rats, pressing attacks even after suffering catastrophic damage. Chokai's captain reported being engaged by what he believed was a cruiser, only to learn later it had been a destroyer escort with 2 5-inch guns. The volume and accuracy of fire from such a lightly armed vessel had been completely unexpected. The Japanese had been correct that American destroyers lacked armor protection. Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts had indeed been destroyed by shellfire that their thin hulls couldn't withstand, but the Japanese assessment had missed a critical factor. American damage control, engineering excellence, and crew determination allowed these vessels to absorb tremendous punishment and continue fighting long after they should have been combat ineffective. Johnston had taken 3 14-inch shells from a battleship and 3 6-inch shells from a cruiser in her first attack run, losing steering and half her power plant. She fought for 3 more hours. Samuel B. Roberts, hit repeatedly by 8-inch shells, continued engaging Chikuma until her ammunition was completely expended. Even after Japanese shells destroyed her engines and started uncontrollable fires, her crew continued fighting their remaining gun manually until physically unable to continue. This resilience came not from armor which these ships didn't have, but from compartmentalization, redundant systems, and crews trained to fight their ships under the worst possible conditions. American destroyers might be thin-skinned, but they were designed to keep fighting even when heavily damaged. Electrical systems were distributed throughout the ship. Steering could be controlled from multiple stations. Guns could be operated manually when power failed. Crews drilled endlessly on damage control and emergency procedures. The radar-directed fire control that American destroyers employed also proved far more effective than Japanese planners had anticipated. Mark 37 fire control systems allowed American 5-inch guns to maintain accurate fire in smoke and rain squalls where optical rangefinders were useless. Johnston, Howell, and Heermann had all scored repeated hits on Japanese ships during conditions where the Japanese struggled to see their targets clearly. Perhaps most importantly, the American destroyer commanders demonstrated tactical initiative and aggressive leadership that Japanese doctrine hadn't accounted for. Commander Ernest Evans hadn't waited for orders before attacking. He had seen the threat, understood immediately what needed to be done, and acted. His decision to charge alone toward an entire Japanese fleet was tactically insane. It was also exactly what the situation required. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland's decision to attack with Samuel B. Roberts was similarly unauthorized but equally necessary. Sprague had ordered the destroyers to attack but hadn't directed the destroyer escorts to join them. Copeland understood that every additional ship pressing the attack increased the chaos and confusion facing Japanese commanders. His destroyer escort couldn't sink battleships, but she could distract them, force them to maneuver, make them believe they faced more opposition than actually existed. The Japanese had also underestimated the psychological impact of aggressive action. When American destroyers charged battleships at suicidal range, Japanese commanders had to respond. They couldn't ignore destroyers launching torpedoes at close range, even if those destroyers were doomed. Ships had to maneuver to avoid torpedoes. Formations broke apart. Pursuit of the carriers was disrupted. Minutes were lost minutes that allowed the carriers to gain distance, launch more aircraft, survive a little longer. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, writing afterward, stated that the success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Rear Admiral Sprague, who had commanded the carriers while his destroyers fought and died to protect them, said simply that the Japanese had been beaten by the indomitable courage of the destroyer and destroyer escort crews who unhesitatingly went in against hopeless odds. The battle's impact extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. In Japanese naval circles, the Battle of Samar marked a psychological turning point. Their most powerful surface force had been turned back by what should have been an insignificant screening force. The assessment that American destroyers were thin-skinned and inadequate for surface action against capital ships had been proven simultaneously correct and irrelevant. Yes, American destroyers lacked armor. Yes, their 5-inch guns couldn't penetrate battleship armor belts. Yes, a single salvo from Yamato's main battery could obliterate a destroyer, but none of that mattered when American crews were willing to close to point-blank range, accept certain destruction, and fight until their ships literally sank beneath them. Armor was meaningless when the alternative to attacking was allowing an enemy force to reach an undefended invasion fleet. The Battle of Samar became required study at post-war naval academies, Japanese, American, and British. It demonstrated that technological assessments of ship capabilities, while accurate in absolute terms, could be rendered irrelevant by human factors that defied easy quantification. Courage, determination, leadership, and tactical initiative could overcome overwhelming material disadvantage, at least long enough to achieve essential objectives. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest military honor. His citation read, "The first to lay a smokescreen and to open fire as an enemy task force, vastly superior in number, firepower and armor, rapidly approached. Commander Evans gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection." Seriously wounded early in the engagement, Commander Evans, by his indomitable courage and brilliant professional skill, aided materially in turning back the enemy during a critical phase of the action. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland received the Navy Cross for his actions commanding Samuel B. Roberts. His citation noted that he had consistently interposed his vessel between the hostile fleet units and our carriers despite overwhelming odds. Rear Admiral Sprague also received the Navy Cross. Every ship of Taffy 3 received a Presidential Unit citation for their collective action during the battle. In 1955, a destroyer escort was commissioned and named USS Evans in honor of Ernest Evans. The ship served until 1968. In 2023, the Navy announced that an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, DDG-141, would be named after Evans, a fitting tribute from a Navy that had learned the value of aggressive destroyer leadership through his example. Samuel B. Roberts earned a unique nickname that persists in naval tradition, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Multiple ships have since carried the name, including a frigate that struck a mine in the Persian Gulf in 1988 and was saved by damage control techniques and crew determination that traced directly back to lessons learned off Samar. The wrecks of Johnston, Hoyle, and Samuel B. Roberts lay undiscovered for decades in the deep waters off Samar. In October 2019, the wreck of Johnston was located at a depth exceeding 20,000 feet, making it one of the deepest shipwrecks ever found. In June 2022, explorers discovered Samuel B. Roberts at an even greater depth, 22,916 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed. Both sites are protected as war graves, monuments to the crews who fought there. The discovery of Johnston's wreck revealed the extent of damage she had sustained. The ship had been literally shot to pieces. Multiple large-caliber shell hits were visible throughout the wreckage. That she had continued fighting for over 3 hours after the initial damage was a testament to her construction and her crew's determination. Explore Victor Vescovo, who led the expedition that found Johnston, noted that examining the wreck drove home the reality of what the crew had faced. They knew they were going to die, and they fought anyway. The tactical lessons from Samar influenced destroyer doctrine for generations. American destroyer training emphasized aggressive action and initiative. Commanders were taught that in crisis situations, the correct response was to attack rather than withdraw, to close range rather than stand off, to accept damage if it meant accomplishing the mission. This mindset, crystallized in the crucible of Samar, became fundamental to American destroyer culture. The battle also influenced ship design philosophy. While armor protection for destroyers remained impractical due to weight constraints, emphasis increased on survivability through damage control, compartmentalization, and redundant systems. The goal was to build ships that could continue fighting even after sustaining heavy damage, exactly what Johnston, Hoyle, and Samuel B. Roberts had demonstrated was possible. Modern destroyers like the Arleigh Burke class, which now form the backbone of the U.S. Navy's surface fleet, incorporate these lessons. They're still lightly armored by battleship standards. Their hulls wouldn't withstand direct hits from large-caliber naval rifles, but they're designed to absorb damage, maintain fighting capability under extreme conditions, and keep their crews alive and effective even when systems fail. The Japanese assessment that American destroyers were thin-skinned had been accurate. What they failed to anticipate was that thin skin wasn't a fatal flaw when backed by aggressive tactics, excellent training, advanced fire control systems, and crews willing to fight until their ships went down. The destroyers off Samar had been outgunned, outarmored, and outnumbered. They had charged anyway, and in charging, they had saved an entire invasion force and helped win one of the most decisive naval battles of World War II. The story of Taffy 3 represents something fundamental about naval combat that transcends technology and doctrine. Ships are built from steel, but they're fought by humans. Tactical assessments can accurately measure gun ranges, armor thickness, and speed capabilities. What they can't measure is the moment when a commander decides that protecting the ships and men behind him matters more than his own survival. They can't quantify the determination of gun crews who keep loading and firing even as their ship burns and sinks beneath them. Japanese admirals had assessed American destroyers as inadequate for surface action against capital ships. In narrow technical terms, they were correct, but on the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, those thin-skinned destroyers and destroyer escorts charged directly into the guns of the most powerful battleship ever built. They fought until they sank, and in sinking, they won. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.